Hey, Professor Fury here. We're doing the advancement of learning with Francis Bacon, working through it step by step, going through it, reading carefully, reading for all kinds of things. We're reading for ideas. We're trying to understand why he's important. And we're really looking at his rhetoric, at how he makes arguments which are elegant and persuasive and dealing with his opponents in a time of incredible political and religious stress, much more than what we're facing now. Big dangers for England, inside and out, living at a time of during the Reformation, Protestants and Catholics killing each other. So his book is kind of the beginning of the scientific project, right? The modern scientific project of using observation in a certain careful, systematic way to come to conclusions, to create medicines, to create knowledge about the universe. But it's also a great model of how you construct arguments. And so I really encourage you all as you go along to just decide for yourself which argument sounds good. When does he seem to be making sense? When does he seem to be trolling? When does he seem to be more fair? And so in this section, he's dealing with the second category of the three major obstacles to establishing a scientific project. So that's the way the book is organized. It's organized in two parts. The first book of the book, it's called the first book, the first part, is about what are the obstacles. And the second part is about what's missing from science that we need to focus on. Some things are already known and some things are not. That's the second part. So the first part, what's the obstacles? He splits them up into three parts, right? And the first part was my previous video, which is the religious objection. Isn't there something a little maybe blasphemous or wrong about wanting to know God's secrets, how God created the natural world and the heavens? So he deals with that. The second group we're dealing with today is about what's the kind of popular opinion of learned men. He calls them learned men, but he's living at the time of very, very well-known and established female intellects like Queen Elizabeth, who he worked for actually. But what are the public kind of stereotypes about learned men that actually keep people from trusting them and keep the project from going forward? And the third is going to be really exciting, and that's going to be about what are obstacles within ourselves that keeps us from learning and gaining knowledge. So this second part is quite beautifully organized. We're going to try to get to most of it. If I don't, no problem. You know, the text is out there. We're going to go through, we're going to read carefully and do as much as we can in a short time. So we're going to take a look at the second group of objections. What is wrong? What is the public stereotype against nerds, right? I'm going to say nerds on purpose because we have these prejudices today, and they had those prejudices then against learned people. And you yourself might be thinking, well, if you stay inside and read too much, isn't that bad for my health? Isn't that bad for this or that? Big Bang Theory features characters who are shy, who are not good with with dating and things like that, and a little awkward. So what is this? What is this all about? So he says, and for the disgraces, in other words, the disadvantages which learning receiveth from politiques, they be of this nature. And then he starts in with all the objections. It softens men's minds to read too much. It makes them less physically powerful. They're not so apt for the exercise of arms. These are the politiques. And you can guess what politiques means. It means public stereotypes, stereotypes that the public holds of learned people. So there's one, there's two, and then we get to other ones. They're too irresolute. They're indecisive because they know so much that they can't make decisions quickly. So they're not good leaders. They're not disposed for matters of government, like it says here. They're too positive. There's another word that in Shakespearean times had a different meaning than it has today. The word positive back then meant you're stubborn and insistent that your way is right. You're positive, but always in the sense of being arrogant. Now notice he never opposes these things. In fact, he keeps stretching them out over a whole page here, right? Because the whole idea is the way his logic works is he gives the other side all of its objections, right? We saw this before. And then he answers the objections one by one in section 2, section 3, section 4, up to section 9. And so he has lots of this is like the opposite of a straw man argument, because a straw man argument, you make your opponent look silly and then it's easy to come back, right? But he's making his opponent look pretty good. He's like, oh, these are all good reasons. People are pretty good. Like, isn't it true that people read too much? They're kind of indecisive. Is that true, really? Right? And then he even gives the example of a great hero, right? He says, well, Cato, this great Roman senator, he kept people out of Rome who might distract young men from their duties as soldiers, as Roman citizens. Like, wasn't, I mean, since we love Cato, didn't he have a good reason to do that? And then he starts responding. And the first response is about, does learning make people physically weaker or make them less effective as leaders? He says, well, let's take a couple examples from history. There's Alexander the Great, there's Julius Caesar. So he says, well, Alexander the Great, as you guys may know, was the student of one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived. He was privately taught by Aristotle himself. Aristotle taught him philosophy. And so then Alexander the Great becomes one of the greatest generals of all time. He invades, most of, near the Near East, all the way up to Persia, all the way up to northern India. Right? Then he dies of flu, okay, in his late 20s, but pretty good leader, right? A pretty effective leader, right? Julius Caesar, the dictator. So there's a little chiaroscuro here, a little tweak here, because the dictator is not a good thing. So the British had an ambivalent feeling about Julius Caesar, because Julius Caesar ended the Roman Republic, this time of relative balance of powers. And he started the Roman Empire, right? He kind of kicked off the Roman Empire. So he's a, little ambivalent figure. But he says, but he was a great leader. And it's true, he was a great leader. He was a great general, and he was a great politician. And why? Because Julius Caesar was a great speaker. Not only that, he was a great writer. And that proves that you don't suffer from reading too much, from studying too much, from accomplishing things in education. You get better at what you want to do. Okay? So that's that one. And then he says here, and I'm not going to read it super carefully because we want to go on. Just as individuals are strong when they're learned, so nations can be strong militarily, strong governments, and be very accomplished in the sciences and the arts and reading. And he gives examples of Egypt, which is a society that was scientifically advanced, architecturally very advanced. Syria, one of the early literary achievements, the big literary achievements happened during the Syrian times, Syrian Empire. Persia, mathematics. Greece, obviously getting closer, philosophy, mathematics, geometry, science, and Rome, law, architecture, and governance. Rome's governance is a great model. The early Rome was one of the places where they first tried the branches of government and the balance of powers, right? So he says, just as these great nations became great during times of great accomplishment in study, just individuals also are like that. So he often does that. He often compares individuals with governments, right? Because he is in the government. Bacon was the Lord Chancellor of England, the very highest position in the government you can have without actually being the king. So, and then he goes, well, what about talking about government more specifically? He says, well, it's kind of like empiric physicians. If you have a government run by empiric people, an empiric physician is a doctor who knows a set of procedures and medicines that work for a set of things that he only knows, right? Or is limited to knowing, let's say. He's empiric. In other words, he knows it from experience. But once you go outside of that experience, the empiric doctor is not very valuable anymore. And you fix that problem by having experience plus reading. If you have experience, but you've also read about medicine a lot, then you're a much better doctor. And he says, likewise, in governments, you might have a king who's a great leader, but they need to have learned men or learned women to help them. Now, there usually were many women ministers. The administration before King James, which is the administration that he's writing under in 1605, was she was the female leader of England, and then the ministers were male. But Elizabeth showed how a very learned woman could be a both a great leader and a very educated person in one. Like she learned from her ministers, but she also happened to be one of the most learned women of her century, and maybe of much of English history until that point. So then he talks a lot about that, and we're going to cut off as soon as possible. I won't be able to get to every single section. I just want to bring a video that's deep and maybe not too long. So I may have to cut a couple sections. But this part here is great. I just kind of underline one part that's so beautiful, which is it true that learned men are irresolute, right? Um, he says, yeah, it is true. We can be slow in deciding because we are thinking of so many alternatives. He says, but we're also good at learning how to hold our fire, how to carry things in suspense. In other words, how to keep from rushing to conclusions until they resolve, until the matter can be resolved. So this is a little bit like that phrase suspension of disbelief, which arose in the Romantic period with Samuel Taylor Coleridge made this up. But that has to do with fiction. This has to do with science and hypotheses, right? We hold things in suspense. In other words, we have things we'd like to be true. We have hunches. But we're going to wait until we have all the facts. So yes, we're slower, but we also ground our conclusions on facts and not on what we want to be true. And so that's this part. Um, we'll skip over to 6. I wish we could do every part really closely, but this is actually cool. He goes, well, you might have noticed that, learned men are kind of pale and they kind of have like weaker muscles. He says, but it's only because learning attracts people with weaker muscles. It's not that it makes their muscles weaker. In fact, learned men who are completely rounded people, like Elizabeth herself, um, are very vigorous. They're both intelligent, well-read, and physically capable. Elizabeth herself, of course, was not a warrior, but she was very physically fit. Like she was well known as a great dancer and had a lot of stamina. And then he has other examples too. And there's many other writers in the English tradition that talk about this balance of physical prowess with mental prowess. And this is an old idea. It's not Bacon's idea. This goes back to the Greeks and the gymnasium and the idea of training the mind and the body at the same time, right? Mens sano in corpore sano, old Latin saying, the healthy mind is in a healthy body, that kind of thing. Many other things. I wish I could go into all of them, but we're just going to end with a little tweak he gives to Cato. He says, well, remember I told you about Cato before, this great senator who was worried about how the Greek philosophers coming to Rome would like slow people down. And we've heard about Socrates and how he was killed because they were worried that he was going to, weaken the minds of the young men, take their minds off of the duty to their nation and stuff. And but he says, but Cato himself, when he was 60 years old, when he was past 60 years old, was taken with an extreme desire to go to school again and learn Greek. So he was 60 and he went back and tried to learn Greek. And he says, see, even Cato, who was worried about the danger of too much reading, he kind of, through his actions, admits that learning is really a great thing to have, right? And so he ends that whole section here with a little kind of acknowledgement of how Queen Elizabeth and Your Majesty, he's writing this whole text to King James, as I've said before, are examples of a government which is working great. Is working great. And he's not exaggerating. Actually, Queen Elizabeth's reign, a very interesting reign, a reign of stability, a reign that avoided some of the huge extremes of the Reformation to some degree, flourishing of art, flourishing of theater, Shakespeare and other writers, flourishing of science, flourishing of even of religious learning under James. You heard of the King James Bible, of course, which is based on a project. It's not just they translated it. They had a whole project of translation and interpretation and discussion that went on for years. And then they produced the King James Bible. So this is a great time for England. Um, there are many bad things happening too, of course, not to sugarcoat things. But what he's saying is, look, we have two learned monarchs, Queen Elizabeth and King James, and this is an example. I barely need to even explain to you that it's possible to have a great leader, great country, um, and at the same time a very learned country. And it's up to you to decide whether this is, as you learn more history and whatever, and to think about our times too, how valuable is it to have an educated, deeply learned um, leadership, right? And even on an individual basis for yourself, how much learning is good that you really want for yourself in a life where you want to balance out with other things, with with things that are important to you, right? So this is the one of the many beautiful things of kind of taking a look at Bacon and seeing how it can not only relate to us, but also bringing a certain appreciation into this this great text. It's a really a great text that you can learn so much from. So thank you so much for listening, and hang out for the next video. I'll put it out soon on the last of the three big objections, which is what are the obstacles within us that keeps us from expanding our knowledge in healthy and organic ways. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next time.